whatever is most comfortable for you. So take a moment to settle into your seats, feel the ground beneath you, and breathe in and out, in and out. O great mystery, who transcends time, yet who walks with each generation, be with us now as we gather this evening, moving in and through us as the voices from different generations represented here, and the ones yet to come, dance and sing together in conversation. Help us to remember that while we are all gathered here in this virtual space, we converse, sitting or standing upon Indigenous land. May we, through our time together, discern your wisdom and go forth in a way which ensures the mutual flourishing of all generations now and in the future. Amen.
Thank you so much, Emily. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our conversation today about intergenerational justice. We thought that this moment was particularly important to be thinking about what intergenerational justice means as our country reckons with the inheritance of systemic racism, as we face another major economic downturn, and as the future of all our lives, and young adults especially, are threatened by climate change. So clearly there's a lot to cover there in terms of thinking about intergenerational justice. But before we delve into our questions, I'd like to have all the participants introduce themselves. If you want to say, obviously, your name and your occupation and faith tradition if you're affiliated, and anything else you would like to share. So can we start with you, Arcelia?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Arcelia Isaias. I am currently a field manager with the organization Renew Mexico. I've been doing advocacy work for primarily renewable energy for the last 2 years, especially in New Mexico. I moved out there 2 years ago. And I grew up Catholic. I was kind of involved in college, but haven't really been practicing as much as I would have liked to. But I still very much maintain and let that guide my decisions and kind of see what my path takes me towards.
Thank you, Arcelia. Linda, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Sepulveda. I currently work at the Norbertine community of New Mexico as a receptionist and administrative assistant. And I also work with the city of Albuquerque with youth programs and training and stuff like that. And I, like Arcelia, I grew up Catholic. I am still, I guess, kind of practicing it. It's a weird time, so like we're not gonna go there yet, but I am Catholic and trying to do my best to feel what that looks like at this time. Yeah, and just doing a lot of virtual content for youth. That's what I've done in person my whole life. So just switching to this virtual platform and learning new things and joining ministries at my parish. And yeah, so that's kind of been just a little bit of the surface.
Thank you, Linda. Derrick, could you introduce?
Sure. So my name is Derrick Toledo. I'm from Jemez Pueblo. I organize with Western Leaders Network, focusing on engaging Indigenous leaders across the interior West on conservation issues, basically making sure that Indigenous folks like myself and our Pueblo and community leaders are at the table. And I also grew up practicing Catholic.
Thank you, Derrick. Emily, you want to give a...
Sure, thank you, Clara. So I'm Emily Syal. I live in Santa Fe, and I've been involved with New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light for just a little bit. I'm actually in transition between occupations right now, but I was the former youth and environmental minister or ministry's resident at the United Church of Santa Fe. But I'm just starting to root myself here in the environmental justice issues in New Mexico. I graduated seminary last year in California, and there I'd focused a lot of my time on interreligious responses to our climate crisis and the intersections between ecology and religion. And I grew up as in part of the United Church of Christ. It's a Christian, progressive Christian denomination. But I also know that my worldview very much aligns with Shakti Tantra Hinduism. So both of those, these very diverse bodies of religion inform a lot of my thinking. So that's where I'm at. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. And my name is Clara Sims. I am from Los Lunas, New Mexico, and I work with New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light and have been for a few years now. And my faith kind of comes at the intersection of thinking about Christianity, especially mystical strains of Christianity and contemplative strains and climate change. I didn't grow up in any faith tradition, but I will be headed to Yale Divinity School this fall, so we'll see where that leads. So before we dive into our questions, as I was reflecting upon this conversation, I realized that I was missing maybe a bit of an overarching frame that I just wanted to give our participants so that they felt like they could voice this at any point in the conversation. And that is simply that when we're thinking about intergenerational justice, I think it'll be really fruitful for people to even just simply name kind of how it feels to be a young adult, whether you feel like you entered that 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 2 years ago. I think that this is a really unique moment to be a young adult with all the crises that have been unfolding around us right now and really for decades. So that's just an invitation to really name how you feel at this moment and how it feels to be a young adult. So the first question is kind of just starting to unpack what intergenerational justice means, because that's a broad term with a lot of facets and connotations. So I thought we could start with each of you kind of just talking about what that term means to you, what you think about when you think about intergenerational justice. So anybody can start.
I can start if it's okay. So because of my background with like learning environmental science, like that's what I studied in college, and being just wrapped up in the environmental movement for so long, that's pretty much my personal lens for which I view intergenerational justice. In my perspective, I think like it's something where, like from the environmental perspective, like looking towards future generations is kind of like the big frame for which we do the work that we do. It's because we want to leave a healthier planet for future generations, because we have been able to use like the resources and take advantage of all that, and we want to make sure that that's available for future generations as well. And to making it a usable and equitable world is something that I think current generations do owe future generations. And I think that's something that we should constantly work towards and kind of see what that meaning and what that would look like.
Yeah, thank you, Arcelia. Climate change is definitely the first thing that comes to mind for me too. How about Derrick and Linda and Emily?
Yeah, I'll go next. To me, I think that intergenerational justice can be traced back to that quote, "We don't inherit the land from our ancestors, we just borrow it from our children." So I see that as us kind of just making sure that this world is safe and clean and sustainable for our children. It's not our world, it's not our land. It's something that we should continue to work together on. Like since I'm from Jemez, I'm used to working and listening to my elders, their stories and their wisdom with the land and vegetation, along with the medicine that can be provided in that. I feel like I can learn from them and then pass it to like my children or like my nieces and nephews. So just making sure that we have this conversation going from my elders to like my children and stuff like that. So that's the justice I see in that.
Yeah, thank you, Derrick.
No, I was thinking of it in a real broad way, because for me, intergenerational justice, from just what I've experienced, and I know we'll get into that a little bit more, but is when, no matter what our ages are, we all are, we have that same goal and that mission, and whether it be towards the good of all or something as broad as that, but that we don't see that age. We're just working towards that, and everyone's using their gifts and talents towards that mission and goal, and making sacrifices if you have to, and continuing the conversation. And I think we do get caught up in age and just different types of ways people like to do things, and then those things just cause barriers. Like intergenerational justice can be in the workplace. I noticed, like, when I got into, certain spaces, that it was hard because some people knew certain types of skills and some people didn't, but we all had the same goal. And that's what always gave me hope. Was I always used to say, well, especially when it was in the educational, when I was working at APS, it was like, everyone is always like, it's about the students though. So if somebody could say that, it would always center everyone back to, yes, it's about the students. And so if you can find that within a space, and it doesn't matter what age you are, I think that's what kind of, I hear, even what people are explaining in this conversation already. And to me, that's what it is.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, that's a really great perspective. Yeah, I really would just, for myself, echo what's been said already. I really think about the concept of intergenerational justice as definitely going both ways, from older to younger and younger to older, and approaching life with a basic understanding that all our lives are inextricable from one another. And I think if you are really rooted in that understanding, you're going to be compelled to act in a way that that brings forth justice for all people and all life as well. Emily, do you want to share anything before I go to the next question?
Yeah, I can. I echo what Arcelia mentioned, that my lens through viewing intergenerational justice definitely comes from the perspective of, our planetary life and our climate, just given my own educational background and involvement. And so to me, I understand it just as a just planet for all generations, ones that live now, and those that are far reaching into the future. And those are often the generations, the ones that are not seen yet, that we seem to forget about in our planning and in our goals going forward. But that we just, thinking about intergenerational justice, what it means, that we honor the inherent goodness of each generation, the history that's been made, and also the future innovation, the stepping into some places that are now unknown. But then they will then be history that's made. So, honoring all of that as we go forward. And I do absolutely believe we owe future generations a healthy planet and clean air and just economic conditions, that they too can earn a living wage without giving up their pursuit of bringing their whole being and creativity into a position. It shouldn't be either or. You can do both. And for me, it's also biblical. The verse in the Bible that Jesus is gathered with this crowd of people, and all of these children come to him, and the disciples scold him because, get the children away. And he says, "Let the children come to me. They are the future of the kingdom of God." And though we may not see the fruits of our own labor ensuring this place for them, our work will still have been done if future generations have this place to be. So for me, it's very biblical, this notion of ensuring justice for generations unseen into the future.
Thank you, Emily, and everyone. I think that's a great launch point for us to continue the conversation. So my next question is what are some aspects of intergenerational justice, or if you want to frame it as injustice that you have observed or experienced in your life and work, and that can be anything. And maybe specific, if you have something specific to New Mexico, I would love to hear that as well.
I wouldn't mind kicking this one off. I like this question because, you know, oftentimes some of my coworkers or different people I have in the network, we would joke about, you know, just the workplace just seeming like it's like high school all over again. You know, as soon as you just, you know, it doesn't matter, like no matter what age we get, or once you're in the workplace, it still seems like, you know, different groups, different cliques, different people not getting along. And so I used to get so irritated when we wouldn't give our high school students the benefit of the doubt. I'm like, they're going to be right alongside working with us, like in just a few years, guys. Like, we have to like let them be, like let them learn who they are. And so I used to get so angry at stuff like that, because I knew that, you know, it was going to just be a similar, you know, environment, just with more adults and more scariness, you know. But for me, and then specific to New Mexico, especially getting into spaces where you're talking about this data around poverty, or you're in spaces where you're in networks where they're trying to solve a problem in a community, and it just like they're talking about your community, and I'm like, wait, and then they start talking in ways they're putting that and you're like, you're speaking for us. I want to raise my hand and say things like, wait, you know, where I'm from there, and that's not who we are, because so it would just make me mad when people would try to voice. But I understand, like, they were trying to help. So it would be things like, oh, they don't seem to care down there. The parents, like, it would be comments about parents, and these could be community meetings, or these could be, you know, school meetings, or all these networks that a lot of people get into. And so I think just these notions around people that grow up in poverty or still live in poverty are just really out there. And it's hard with New Mexico, where all of us are, you know, a lot of people experience that and try to get out of that. And so just like I said, it's just rough out there when you get into the world and you're trying to constantly, I don't know if the words prove yourself, but really, you know, like, you know, try to move up, trying to do what you can to get that message across. And so it just feels again like you're in a scary space, like high school. But some people enjoyed high school, so I shouldn't say that it wasn't. But yeah.
Thank you, Linda. That's really interesting, and yeah, it strikes me as true that so often we kind of assume we know why people think the way they do or act the way they do when we're trying to help, but we don't include their own voices, and we lose a lot, I think, in terms of enacting any form of justice when we don't include people. Do others have thoughts about this question?
I can just bounce off of what Linda had said a little bit. That what really stood out to me, Linda, when you said, you know, that I oftentimes I think now, as I am a young adult experiencing, like, kind of transitioning in the workplace, like entering a space and constantly having to prove myself, which I think every generation in the past has had to do. But it always feels like we're the only ones at the same time sometimes. And so I think, but I can see, like, in my own life and work experience, there's often this hesitation for any of the generations to trust one another. I mean, like you were raising the image of high school, but this hesitation for generations to trust one another. And you know, maybe if we start from a place of valuing and honoring the vision, skills of each other, you know, imagine that vast generational knowledge that could be tapped into, but also how far into the future it could go if we allowed innovation and some of the newer ideas that are coming about as a result of this time that we're in, to also be tapped into. I think it'd be a really magical place to live if we did that. Yeah, anyway, that's all.
Thank you, Emily.
I'll add on to that. I think from just what I personally observed, I think a big barrier is that I think the definition of justice will need to change a little bit, like something that was thought to be something that's justifiable for like future generations doesn't necessarily apply with the state of how, you know, like our society and our technologies and everything is advancing. So like, for example, from what I've observed in like the environmental movement with like renewable energy, there's always this issue that comes up of like, well, the job replacements, like it's never going to be one-to-one, but really taking a step back and really looking at how the world is shifting in terms of everything becoming more automated. Like that's kind of an issue that we need to really like look into and think of, like that's something that's going to change in like all aspects of every jobs as we're entering this new kind of phase in society. And maybe it doesn't have to be a bad thing, like all of society is like us trying to make things easier for future generations, like that's how we've always advanced. But we need to kind of come to grips that that's going to look different than how it was before, in order for us to think of what these solutions are. Like, what are people's jobs going to look like? What is it that we really need to transform in terms of making the market accessible and making everyone have like equal opportunities in this new economy that we're going into?
Yeah, thank you, Arcelia. That brings up a lot of, or another aspect of how much our world is rapidly shifting in so many ways. Derrick?
Yeah. And to me, I think I'll give an example of both and what each one means to me. Just because I come from the environmental organizing, I see something like the Flower Hill Institute as being intergenerational justice. Flower Hill is basically a traditional man teaching like youth and teenagers about certain issues or certain the language that we speak, or even plants that seeds that we use to plant, like maize and squash and everything. Also just taking teenagers up to the mountains and learning about our historical sites, learning about traditional sacred sites up there, and why those sites even exist to begin with, and how our ancestors even survived through hardship 500 years ago, just by working together and by persevering. I think that's something that can be considered intergenerational justice for me. And injustice would be something like industry, oil and gas industries coming into New Mexico and just tearing up land. They're not thinking about the future. They're not thinking about what's going to happen when these wells run dry. It's just going to be disaster for New Mexico in the long run if we keep selling off parcels of land. I think that's an injustice. From an intergenerational injustice is just not looking forward and thinking about the future and just continually trashing the land. So I think that's injustice to me.
Yeah, thank you, Derrick. I also, in my thinking about my response, was thinking about industry and even just really the model of capitalism in general as being something that's supposed to grow exponentially when we know we live on a planet of finite resources, and how that really doesn't add up to ensuring the well-being of people and economies and other life. And your examples, Derrick, bring up the next question, I think, which you kind of touched on with the Flower Hill Institute and that dialogue and knowledge, or transmission of knowledge between generations. But the next question is, what are some of the dialogues that you would like to see happening between older and younger generations? And you can answer that first, and kind of a piggyback question is, what do you want older generations to understand about your generation's values and priorities?
Okay. I think that
if anyone wants to tackle.
I'll go first, I guess. I would like to see educated and informed conversations about really preserving and ensuring a clean, healthy, sustainable future, not just in my village or New Mexico, but our planet overall. I love to travel and I love to meet new people. I think that the more that we focus on each other and how we can change things for the better, that's something that we should really focus on. Things have changed from 40 years ago to now. Technology has advanced since those times. I think the plan or the conversations that we should be having are how we erase all the negative or the old ways, and how we can become more efficient in just, for example, like car emissions. Why are we still focused on the gas? Why are we still driving everywhere? I felt like in cartoons when I was watching as a kid, in 2020, they're driving around flying cars that don't use gas, and we're still using gas vehicles. So that's something that I think that we could start focusing on, like letting go of the past old ways that haven't been efficient and are just polluting and destroying land. And I think we should just start focusing on how we can start making things better by using less gas or using less natural resources that won't be replenished for another 50, 100 years.
Thank you, Derrick. What are other people thinking?
I can maybe just slightly bouncing off of what Derrick had said, and just thinking more like even more broadly, not just about a particular issue, but just like, you know, what conversations could happen between the older and younger generations. You know, at least in terms of, I've expressed, and I think Linda and some others have expressed in terms of entering the workforce and such, you know, it's always, I've been told it's exciting to get a new, young, youthful, fresh perspective. We're excited to have this energy, and then, but when it comes time to actually implement these new perspectives that have arisen, I think for a lot of us from this time that we're in, living in this, in between this massive shift that's happening, when it comes time to actually implement those things, there's less excitement about it. Kind of falls away. It's like, oh, we're excited you're here. Give us some exciting new perspectives, but we might not use it. And so, you know, how the conversation, I guess the dialogue I'd like to see happen is like, how do we translate that excitement that comes about younger generations' ideas beyond excitement and into empowerment and action in those ideas? And on the flip side too, how do we as younger generations, you know, learn to honor and tap into the vast wisdom of older generations, not just by saying, you know, we respect it or we honor it, but actually taking it into ourselves and pursuing it in action. So, you know, that way could be applied to a number of our various things we face in our world today. But yeah, I'd like to see how I think that the almost the distrust it seems between the generations, how can we move beyond that, move beyond just telling each other we're excited about each other and actually empower each other and lift each other up in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. That kind of piggybacks onto my thinking a bit as well, thinking about how we really start having a fruitful relationship and dialogue of solidarity. And my thought, or my personal experience, is that I feel frustrated sometimes when older generations say things like younger generations are so amazing and they give us so much hope, especially thinking about climate change. And I was really struck with Greta Thunberg's now probably very famous UN speech where she kind of says, "How dare you say we give you hope?" And it's not that I want to belittle the gesture of what that means and the faith in younger generations that it conveys, but I want to say to older generations, I want you to give me hope, because the immensity of the challenges that we face are far beyond what people just entering the workforce can hope to really have agency over. And I think there's so much justice in laying responsibility at those who truly do have power within our government system and within the workforce. So I guess a better way to maybe express great gratitude to young people is, you know, thank you for being a leader, and now I'm going to be a leader too. That would help me. Arcelia and Linda.
Yeah, I definitely love what you're saying, everybody, and I think what I feel about is going to connect, and especially in the sense that earlier I talked about barriers. I said barriers, and a lot of times when we talk about these systems or people, it's people in positions of power in the systems. So it's really just people and people and personal agendas, politics too, whatever you want, all the P's are in there. But the people and personal agendas is really barriers within all different kinds of systems. The ones that I've been in have been, you know, parks and recreation, it's been education, out of school time programs. So it's not programs that are like core instruction, you know, but even just having to fight for certain things within a program after school, or trying to fight with getting funding on a certain amount of time. Like there's all these just different barriers. And then when I was actually, and I would say when it, because I'm not in the work right now, I took a step back from that because it was very overwhelming to see, like, you have these great ideas like Emily's talking about, like you come in and you're like, here's how we're gonna, you know, just tackle this one piece that's just missing so that we can just, you know, serve more kids better. That's what I'm trying to do. We're just trying to serve more kids better. And then they're like, oh, well, that's, you got to go talk to so-and-so in this area and she ain't gonna budge. And I'm like, oh, like that's it? And I had a couple of times where I was successful just by having a conversation with somebody who said, I haven't, you know, really haven't talked to somebody about this in a while, or it was just like a breakdown of communication, or it was just about building relationships, which is the bottom line, you know, when it comes to, you know, generations and what we can do is just, you know, build relationships with one another, learn each other's stories, try to be patient with one another and share who we are. One of the things I believe in greatly is positive youth development. I do training for, like, basically to help adults that work with young people to remind them, like, how to, you know, help them grow up. And I want to share this quote, and it's, I'm not gonna tell you who it's by or where it's from until after. So it says, let's get rid of that, sorry. Our youth love luxury. They have bad manners and despise authority. They show disrespect for their elders and love to chatter in place of exercise. Young people are now tyrants, not the servants of their household. They no longer rise when their elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up food, and terrorize their teachers. So this was actually Socrates, you know, the Greek philosopher, so it was 400 BC. And so it's really interesting when we share that quote and ask people to guess, and sometimes they say even now. And so youth and elderly people, the generations are always going to be, like somebody said that in here already, it's always going to be, you know, some tension there. And so it's just a matter of trying to work through that and reminding ourselves of, you know, the things that matter to us. And, you know, we all love food, so we can, you know, share in food, and there's a lot of things that can bring us together. And but in this crisis, it's been really, really difficult to try to do that. But I've like I said, I found some church ministry, like Ken on the call here today. He's in that group, and, you know, there's been a lot of people who've, you know, I've met that I would have never probably even met at the parish without it being in this virtual scene. And so it's weird for me to think about seeing them in person, because I've been in this ministry for about 3 months with this group and haven't seen a lot of them. So anyways, those are just some very random thoughts that come to mind.
Oh, thank you, Linda. That's an excellent quote. I was definitely thinking modern, except for the word tyrant. Doesn't quite fit, maybe. Arcelia, do you want to answer this at all before we move on?
Yeah, I would just absolutely like to echo all the points that were made. I think, yeah, absolutely, there's always going to be a disconnect between like our different generations of values. And I think ultimately what we need to come back to is that fundamentally we all care about doing right by our children, our future children. And I think coming back to that, it's a way that I think it's a good way to connect to what our values, like as per each generation, and how they're going to change and what our priorities are going to change, be it like more holistically looking at what's like good for the collective, what doesn't work before. I think if we can like come back to that, I think that's something that could really help to continue the dialogue between these different generations that always tend to clash.
Thank you, everyone, for all those answers. So the second part of that question was, what do you want older generations to understand about your generation's values and priorities, which we can still talk about. But my next question was sort of on the flip side of that. Are there things about older generations' values and priorities you wish you understood better, and this might serve a Q&A section later if you have any ideas.
So I will jump in with the technology thing, because I get really frustrated when we're like accused of loving technology too much, because I do love it and I know how to use it, but I also have, you know, I know when to step away from it too, and to balance myself and just be with nature and my guitar or something, you know. And so it's sometimes I feel like we don't get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to stepping away from technology. Maybe that's just I'm like older 30s. I'm like the older young adult, but that's what I call myself anyways. I just turned 38, and so you know, it's I'm there. You know, I know like I can be addicted to my phone in some ways, but also it bothers me. I got to put it away too, and so I think that kind of is something that I just want to we know. And also like that patience with helping understand technology or whatever fears in there with folks. And what was the other side of it? Oh, learning, yeah.
The flip side, yeah.
Yeah, the flip side, yeah. Kind of similar to what Derrick was saying, and getting back into like just where they came from, like their roots, and like growing again, and all that kind of stuff. Like I feel like my mom's constantly always the one trying to remind me about gardening and reminding me about all these things, and then she'll always share her childhood with me, and my dad doesn't always, but when he does, it's like, whoa, like I didn't even know that story, like recently telling me stories that I didn't even know. And so it's like share those things, you know, and let us know like what you did as a kid, and then that way we can do that too, even if it was, you know, planting a cherry tree or something. Like I want to do that so I can say that it was passed down, so that kind of stuff.
Thank you, Linda.
I do have, for the flip side question, are there things about older generations' priorities, values, or concerns that I wish I understood better? I guess I don't know if my question might cover some of those things. It's more of a direct question about now. Like I just wonder, does the time that we're in right now, this time that keeps being said that is unprecedented, that we're coming up against this new normal, in all aspects, whether we're talking about the pandemic, the kind of now the overflowing of this movement about breaking down the system of racism, or even climate change, does this time we're in feel different than perhaps these big eras of change in all of your lives? Or does it feel the same, or what? I would like to hear kind of some of that. How did eras of change happen before? And is this something different, or is it just another one? You know, that was my only question, and I think that can be saved for the question and answer time. So,
yeah, thank you. We're gonna get there really soon, but we'll definitely hold that, Emily. Thank you.
I actually also had that same like thoughts as Emily did, just kind of looking at what justice and, you know, what our different concerns are. And, you know, obviously like things are going to change, but just looking, especially during the times, people keep comparing like, oh, it's like the civil rights movement and the like all these different plague times like all rolled into one year. And, you know, we joke about it, but there is like a sense of like, yeah, the history like does have a sense of like repeating, or things keep like coming back. So I guess I'd want to know more about the concerns that the older generations have had in the past. Like where can you see that being repeated? And also, is there like, are we just doomed to always repeat these different concerns and always fight for these kind of similar injustices? Or is there a way to kind of like break free from that and also just kind of move forward in another direction and kind of break that cycle eventually?
That's a great question, Arcelia. Thank you.
And I think if there was something that I would want to understand better from our older generations, I want to know why I can watch Malcolm X movie or read his book right now, and all the same issues and all the same type of events are still happening right now. How is it that 60 years later, we're still fighting and trying to agree or make sure that people understand that Black Lives Matter. Why are we still fighting over statues that shouldn't be up anymore? And it's been, what, 400, 500 years since that conquistador came into New Mexico. That's what I want to understand a little bit more, how our older generations put up with that type of treatment, and why aren't we learning more about our own history? You know, how come people, that's what I want to understand a little more. How come we let it get this far to these unprecedented times where not only pandemic is causing huge waves of chaos, but so are all the protests and everything. It's just so much going on, and how have our older generations let it go on this long that it's our fight now?
Thank you, Derrick, and everyone for starting to frame up those questions. I think mine is very similar to wondering kind of how we came to this moment, and also wanting to know from older generations if this truly does feel different. And my intuition is that how can it not, because especially with the overlaying of climate change over all of these issues and how much that kind of threatens the fundamental ways in which we conduct business. But my question is kind of specific to the boomers. My mom might appreciate me framing my understanding of a movement that happened, you know, in the 60s and 70s for a lot of people of seemingly really starting to push back against a lot of dominant narratives around consumption and capitalism and what we really need to be happy. And I don't think that obviously is a thread that has continued to run through generations leading to our own, but I guess just wanting to know, like, where did that like kind of fizzle out, and what made people feel like they either had to compromise their values or wanted to compromise their values, and not really like continue to really like put forth a countercultural narrative, because it seems like a lot of the same wisdom that we're coming to now about living more simply was there before this. So that's one of my questions, and I think, why don't we just go ahead and open it up? This is about the time we wanted to do that. So perhaps if anybody wants to restate a question, or if anybody in the audience feels like they want to respond in any way, they can just unmute themselves and jump in. And we want to hear your questions for us. So any of those options.
Well, I'll jump in since I was named specifically, being a boomer. And so I'll just give you my thought, my best wisdom at this moment is that certainly I was coming of age when we were fighting and protesting the Vietnam War and overconsumption, and the question, why did that fizzle out? It certainly was true in my lifetime that I think there was still a perspective, at least for me, that there was still a lot of resources. I think we weren't as focused on the resource issue. It made sense to live simply, but it also made sense to kind of move into where our parents had been in terms of having a good life with children and a house and a career. And so there was more of a sense of security, I think, at that point in time. Maybe there shouldn't have been, but that's where I see it. And this time, as you all are, and we are joining in some of these fights and being concerned about climate change and racism, seems less that your perspective would be that life is not as secure as we saw at that point in time. So I don't know if
Thank
that's
you.
helpful.
That is helpful. Thank you.
Well,
Geri, did you?
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Geri. You have some-
Okay. I'm a friend of Anne's and Clara's and Arcelia's, and we're involved in Valencia Renewables. So we've been working across generations trying to continue to fix things. But you're right that somehow we failed. And I don't know if that we need to reach a tipping point when finally everything is clear that there's no other direction but where we're headed. It does feel that way now. I think these are unique times, but back when we were young, I think we considered dropping out. Some of us dropped out. We wanted to get free of that system, but we came to the conclusion that you can be in the world, but not of the world. But now we're learning that no, it's hard to be in the world right now. It's not a safe place. So somehow we have to figure out how we can ask you to take over, because I think I worry so much about you guys because we're leaving you such a huge, huge task. And I just, as a retired person looking toward 80, don't know how much more I can do. I tend my garden and try to live simply, like you say, but I think it's past my time now, and I can only hope and pray that you are up to the task.
Thank you, Geri. And thank you for all the wonderful work you do in our community.
Can I ask Geri and Anne a question?
Yeah, of course.
What do we have to do now to make sure that we're not fighting the same battle 40, 30 years from now? What do you think will help us succeed in making sure that things actually change instead of continuously having history repeat itself? What could we do?
I don't know, Derrick, I think that's the way history works. We heard about Socrates, you know, it seems like every new generation has to confront these issues, and there's no easy answer. And all I can say is I can tell that you are articulate and you care and you've thought it through. And I have a lot of faith in your ability to deal with it. I just wish you didn't have to.
Joan, did
You know, Derrick,
Go ahead, Anne, and then I'll go after Anne. Yeah.
I think if I had it to do over, Derrick, would be my advice would be to not have been seduced as much by material wants and needs, and I think it's tricky to not get seduced, if you will, by the world. And I think it comes back to really maintaining that passion in your heart for what you know is most important, and really keep that as your lodestar. And I'm saying that having kind of now circled back near the end of my life to really getting more involved with causes, and wishing I had stayed with the fight, if you would.
So I'll jump in.
Well, Anne, I think you underestimate your contributions as a lawyer, and I never thought that you got seduced by consumption. You live fairly simply, I would say.
Well, that's sweet. Thank you.
So I'll jump in. I don't know that I'm the best person to answer this question, because I mean, what I've chosen in my life is to live this life, vowed life in terms of the Catholic Church, but it really is a life focused on spiritual path and trying to live simply and justice and caring for the common good for the earth and for people. But I want to say that I do, you know, I just have so appreciated this conversation. You all just have so much insights, and I really, really appreciate your questions that I'm going to reflect on more. And this one is a particularly poignant one, I think, that would require even more conversation. I do think this is a very different time. You know, I grew up in a rural area in Kansas, so, you know, the Vietnam was a headline in and it was some, you know, people, you know, going off to war. So, I mean, I really wasn't engaged in that. I wasn't old enough. But I have been involved in it, you know, since then, since college, in these struggles for justice and equity, and certainly not perfect by any means, but trying. But I remember when I was in Colorado Springs, living with women who didn't have shelter, and we were living with them and working to address the economic capitalist system that funded military but not human needs or earth needs, and was part of community. So I've always been part of community, and we would sit around, you know, having these discussions and sharings and meals and saying, when will the revolution come? How is it going to transpire? We keep working and working and working, and it doesn't seem to change. And so, but I feel now, to me, it feels like we're in that moment. So what would happen so it is not just repeating and we really don't get to that place? And there need to be deep systemic, not just shifts, but radical change, which people are going to resist and continue to resist. But I think, you know, I follow certain people and thinking like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Ilia Delia is a Franciscan sister, and she has a site called Omega. And she has been talking, and I hold true to this too. Our worldview has to shift. The lens through which we see things has to shift. And she just gave a presentation, and I'm not sure if it's online yet. It was just a week ago, where she unpacks the Christian Adam myth of Adam in the garden, and that is the myth that this country continues to live out. And it's a myth of a patriarchism, white or European male patriarchism that, you know, is the lens for everything. And that's why we have these, you know, forces in such conflict right now as well, I think. But most of us do not realize that this is a myth that has so much power over us, and these archetypal parts of that myth. And so we have to change the story, and that is difficult. And we, you know, we have to work at it together. We have to have these kind of conversations in order to, you know, undo that. To, you know, another one is, Derrick, you know, I think of you especially with the Catholic Church and what we've done to Indigenous people and the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery. I have been talking about the papal bulls and doctrine of discovery, which, if you haven't heard of that, it's really what gave permission for those to conquest to come into this continent, this place, and say that, you know, if somebody is not a Christian, then they don't really exist. The land is empty, so it can be taken. And the church has not, in my estimation, really said that was wrong, and we renounce those doctrines of discovery, that papal bull, because some of that same mentality is still there. So we talk about extractivism. It's the same kind of thing. It just is repeated again and again, and it's that kind of worldview. It's that myth that we're living out of that is not serving us on the planet. Somebody mentioned, you know, that we really need to be working internationally and for the planet. And so we have to shift these things, and we have to work at it. And I think it takes groups, conversations. Yeah, we have to. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I, not being of an older generation, Derek, but thinking about your question and sort of the responses here, I think about why I decided in part to be a history major is trying to understand, obviously, how we came to this moment in terms of our Western values and all of those things, but also just how cultural changes take place. And I think that they are generally pretty incremental and slow, and that's part of what's frustrating, is that these archetypes, these patterns, they keep repeating themselves. But I really do agree with Joan that we're in a moment, a very catalytic moment, where there is more opportunity than there often is to really start to break down narratives and dismantle them and shift the story. One of my favorite ideas or quotes, I can't remember who said it, of course, but is that we don't need more successful people, we need people who speak differently. And I think that that actually is happening in this moment in a significant way, which we're seeing with all the protests, and even just the fact that these statues are being taken down, I think is really significant, that people really, really want to change the story.
Thank you. I'm Baji, and friend of Ann's and Clara's and Ward's, and it's great to be here on this discussion. And I want to thank you for organizing it. It's really great to hear all your voices, your young voices. And I want to work with you to move our world forward, because I think one of the themes is what you've said, is that we have to work together across generations to change, to transform in so many different ways. And I was very active in the 60s and 70s in anti-war stuff and civil rights stuff. And then part of my career, a big part of my career, is working in early childhood education, which I see as a social justice issue and really racial justice also. I mean, getting all kids off to a great start is so important. And so I want to work with you. This is a wonderful discussion, and you know, how do we continue this and go forward and do things? And we have to have structural change. We have to, you know, get money out of politics. We've got to change the Supreme Court. There's so many structural things that we need. We need democracy to win in November, and you know, so working together on all of these things is and going deep. I mean, Clara, you said change usually is very incremental and slow to happen, but yet when you think of what's happened in the last month or two, well, if you extend that to 4 months with the COVID-19 and then the racial. I mean, who could have imagined all of a sudden things are happening very quickly. And yet to have that be a permanent change, a transformational change, again, will be incremental and will take a lot of work. So in any case, you know, I don't have a crystal ball other than knowing that we've got to work together to bring about these changes, and this evening tonight is part of it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Baji. Ken, did you also have a comment or question?
I was just going to offer a couple of reflections, but how much time do we have?
We would go to 7:45 if that is good for everyone.
Well, it won't take me that long, but
well, we might have some more.
yeah. Well, just a couple of things. About 25 years ago, I went to a liturgical conference somewhere, and a theologian named Nathan Mitchell spoke, and he said that he stood there and he said, as an aging white male of Northern European descent, I do not exactly represent the future of the Catholic Church today. And I live in that world, so that was very meaningful for me. And everybody in the room laughed, including me. And of course, today, 25 years later, I look in the mirror and I see an aging white male of Northern European descent who doesn't represent the future. And so it's been quite an awakening for me to live in this time. And you know, I grew up in the years of the civil rights movement and the Cuban Missile Crisis and Vietnam War and all of that unrest and the energy crisis. And then remember in the 80s when corporations went from being corporate citizens to being mostly concerned about their shareholders, and have just seen many, many economic changes ever since. And I was thinking about the fact that when I was a kid, I lived in a neighborhood, a suburban neighborhood in Ohio, and everybody in the neighborhood was white. And all the African Americans lived on the other side of town. And one year a German family moved in, a guy that worked for NCR Corporation, and we were all just like, oh no, what's happened to our neighborhood? You know, and of course it was another Northern European, and we couldn't even handle it. But I guess what I think about right now is that when I remember the civil rights movement, and I was a fairly young kid at the time, but I was very aware of what was going on, it felt like black against white, you know, European Americans against African Americans. And that's how it got talked about all the time. And it was very kind of a confrontational thing. Today, what I've experienced in the last few months here seems much more like a generational clash. It feels more to me like old white America struggling against the new voices and a much different, much more unified voice of younger generations. And I see a real difference in that when I'm listening to all this. I heard for the first time in my life about the 1921 race riot and massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'm thinking, how in the world did I go through all the education I've been through and never hear about that? My wife and I adopted a biracial child whose dad is African American and Native American. And I'd never heard of that before. And one day in Old Town, I saw this book. And I read this book and I thought, how in the world did I never hear about this reality of how the Native Americans and the escaped slaves banded together to fight against the Europeans? How did I not know about that? You know, and I just got this book like 24 years ago. And so there's all these things that I think people know so much more about today that can only help break down some of this old white man syndrome that we've had for so many years. And, you know, partly that's hard for me to say as an old white guy, you know, but it's also very refreshing for me to see the generational thing happening and the, you know, kind of the diversity of our country coming together with a single voice. And I really do think that it's going to take new leaders to rise up, and it's naturally going to happen because the old white guys are going to die off. And I just see new, younger leaders with a much more diverse view of the world growing into positions of stronger voices and political control and financial control and all the things that will slowly but surely create a transformation that's much needed. It's going to take time. I probably won't see it, but I'm seeing signs of it starting, and that's exciting for me. It's very exciting to see the beginnings of that. And I've been watching it for a while, but it's just very exciting. Long overdue.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah. Thank you. That's great perspective and affirmation too. Does anybody have any feedback, especially from our participants, on those comments or any other questions?
I do want to say that everything that's been happening in this last segment just kind of reminded me. I had some breakthrough conversations with my parents, and that's been the hardest part. Is it's not always, it's people close to us sometimes that we're actually having to have the hardest conversations with, because I've never wanted to have a certain conversation with my dad because it was going to be disrespectful. It seemed like that. Like, I'm like, Dad, that's wrong. Like the way you're thinking, kind of, I want to say that to him, but I don't want to because he's going to get mad, you know, but, you know, and my mom is very much, she always just says, they're resetting. Everything's resetting. Yep. That's all. She just like, she knows what's going on. It's happening. And then my dad, you know, one of the things that I really valued is he kind of, he shared a little bit with me on how he felt about the protests and all those things. Because once the news comes on, I try to leave, because if the news is on, he's gonna say something that's gonna bother me. And so the protests were on, and then I just decided, let's have the conversation. And he talked about, you know, we got to be humble. He said, we have to stay silent. We shouldn't be saying anything. And I'm like, no, Dad. I said, we have to. I said, the systems that don't work for us, they're supposed to work for us, our government. I said, all of these things, I said, are supposed to be in our favor. I said, and do you notice nothing seems to be working for us and our family? And I said, that's not okay. I said, we have to speak up and say something. And he walked away, but he went to just go get something downstairs. So I thought he was mad, and then he came back up, and, you know, and we were just talking about it. And he shared some experiences from, you know, living in Texas and coming back and forth from Texas to New Mexico, and some experiences that he had that I never knew about. And just understanding that he was just trying to keep the peace within his own family and not be a part of any system or make any changes or any movement. But that's not who I am. And so he's learning that about me, is that I am gonna, you know, I'm gonna ask the questions. I'm gonna say things. And so I think we're there. Like I said, just having these conversations are really difficult, but we have to do it. And one of the things that I did that I never would have done is, I know the Archbishop had this town hall here, and I was like, I'm gonna submit a question. You know, that's something that I would never have done. They didn't ask it, so then I'm like, I'm gonna go submit it again. You know what I mean? And so, and it was really around, you know, and so I'm like, I'm gonna be a part of those things a little more actively and really, you know, voice my opinion around our systems and how they're not working for us, and my experience around that. And so I know that I'm ready for that, and it's really refreshing to hear that we do have some leaders in our community who, like Emily said, are ready to kind of pass that torch and let us, because I know I've been waiting in certain situations to just, you know, just change the system, but it's those, like I said, things that are holding it back. So I'm ready.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, I think one of the things I'm definitely coming away with from your comment and just this conversation in general is really how this is kind of the microcosm of changing the macro conversation, and it is so much having even just one-on-one conversations with people we already have relationships with, because relationships are ultimately what break down barriers. So thank you so much for that perspective. In our remaining minutes, does anyone else have anything they want to share or ask?
I can go. I want to say, as crazy as these times may seem with the president that we have in office, he has done one thing right. He pissed all of us off, and to the point we're all activated now. We're engaged, and we're active in a lot of different issues now. We were comfortable, like Geri said, we were comfortable with like Obama, but now we're not. A lot of things have changed. A lot of people are activated now. I've been talking to, when I go to the Roundhouse and lobby legislators, they tell me they started running because of the guy in office who's sexist and misogynist. A lot of people have been activated, and I think that's a good start to making sure that these battles that we're fighting are actually won, and that they stay won, so that history doesn't exactly repeat itself again. Maybe the battles in the future will be less extreme than they are now, but I think that we're headed in the right direction. And just from all the points of views that you all shared, from being comfortable and from having those fights, I think this time, I think a tipping point, like you said, a tipping point was reached, and now everyone's activated, and I think now things can go forward and things can actually change. So I'm excited about that.
Absolutely, that's a great way to frame the silver lining of Trump presidency. Anybody else want to say anything before we close?
I just want to jump off what Derrick just said, that because that's really illuminated for me what is different about when we were young and doing protests about Vietnam and civil rights, etc., is that there is much more. I think that was really very much a youth based movement, and this is this unique moment where I think because of Trump's election, many people of across several generations, as old as Geri and I and younger than us, and then as young as you all are motivated to do something. And so I hadn't thought about the difference between the 60s and 70s and now in terms of the intergenerational commitment to making a difference.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about, that we're already and maybe and already have facilitated more dialogue between generations than had previously taken place. Anybody else?
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you so much for Clara organizing this and all the rest of you who participated in the panel. Really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
So I want to thank you too. It's just wonderful. And let your friends know that it's on Facebook. It's also on the YouTube so they can listen to it, and even still put in questions to our presenters tonight if they want.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been a part of this, from the audience and the panelists especially, for bringing all your wisdom. This was really, really rich conversation, and I think I'm glad that it's gotten recorded so that other people can benefit. And just thank you for bringing all your wisdom and deep love of the world to this conversation.
Likewise to you. Thank you.
All right, everyone, have a wonderful night, and hopefully we'll be in conversation again.
Good.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you. Thank you.